We see them all the time, right? You land on the homepage of one of the world's most powerful corporations, and you're greeted with these endless, lush green forests and the bold promise of a completely carbon-neutral future. Tree planting is heavily marketed to us as the ultimate solution for environmental stewardship. But have you ever actually stopped to wonder how an industrial titan can pump out millions of tons of carbon while simultaneously claiming to be net zero? Well, today, we're unfolding the hidden layers of our atmospheric reality to unpack the hard data behind those net zero claims. I'm your guide, and this is Info Now, where we break down the world's greatest explainer stories, one paperfold at a time.
Okay, let's dive into this. Can a single sapling truly neutralize an industrial titan? Keep this core question in the back of your mind as we go. Because today, we're taking a strictly investigative, data-driven look at the actual biophysical constraints of our planet. We really want to figure out if these massive corporate offsets are actually doing what they claim to do.
Chapter 1. The Carbon Footprint Illusion.
To really wrap our heads around today's corporate offsets, we've got to look back at how climate responsibility was originally defined. And the timeline here is fascinating. In 1988, the IPCC was established to track global emissions. Makes sense, right? But look at what happened in 2004. British Petroleum, working alongside the advertising agency Ogilvy and Mather, launched the world's very first personal carbon footprint calculator. And honestly, this was a strategic masterclass. By suddenly putting all the focus on your personal recycling habits and how long you spend in the shower, they successfully shifted the entire burden of climate guilt away from the massive industrial producers and placed it squarely on you, the consumer. But as we'll see, 2026 is shaping up to be a massive turning point where mandatory substantiation finally changes the game.
And this brilliantly illustrates why that whole personal footprint campaign was so distracting. The data shows that since 1988, despite all of our individual footprint calculations and at-home recycling, just 100 active fossil fuel producers account for a staggering 71% of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions.
Moving on to Chapter 2. The Physics of Reforestation.
So transitioning from historical marketing tactics to the actual, literal, biological constraints of using trees to clean up these massive emissions, the basic physics problem here is something called sequestration lag. Think about it like this. When a ton of CO2 is emitted by a factory today, its warming effect on the planet is basically immediate. But a newly planted sapling? It faces this massive 20 to 50-year temporal gap before it can biologically absorb that same amount of carbon. And hey, that's assuming the tree even survives to maturity. The physics of atmospheric warming simply do not match the slow pace of biological growth.
Now, to try and speed this whole process up, corporate projects will often favor fast-growing tree species, but science reveals this universal growth-lifespan trade-off. Sure, fast-growing trees generate quick carbon credits, but they naturally have lower wood density and much shorter lifespans. Because these intensive forests die younger, they release their stored carbon right back into the atmosphere much sooner. Native, slow-growing forests obviously offer much more permanent storage, but, well, they just don't fit very neatly into quarterly corporate climate pledges.
And what's even more surprising is that planting trees can sometimes create a carbon deficit. Actually, scratch that. It's not just surprising, it's totally counterintuitive. Research from the Hutton Institute's Moore-Co plots revealed that on carbon-rich soils, the very act of disturbing the ground to plant a tree triggers microbial breakdowns. In some of these plots, net carbon losses were still being observed 12 years after planting. The young trees literally couldn't absorb enough carbon to make up for what was released from the soil just by planting them.
So the crucial point here is that biological sinks carry a massive reversibility risk. Yes, they are cheap, costing about $30 to $50 a ton compared to super expensive engineered solutions, but they are highly, highly fragile. Just think about the 2021 bootleg fire in Oregon. In a single season, that wildfire completely wiped out woodlands that were serving as carbon offsets for Microsoft. In a flash, it instantly turned a carbon sink right back into a massive carbon source.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the carbon market mirage.
If we look at the digital systems validating these claims, specifically the voluntary carbon market and those red D+ avoided deforestation credits that megacorporations love to buy, this number is just staggering, 400%. A landmark investigation found that Verra, which is the world's largest certifier of these credits, had projects overstating the threat of deforestation by an average of 400%. By projecting wildly unrealistic, catastrophic rates of future deforestation, project developers were generating phantom credits. They were literally taking credit for saving trees that were never actually at risk of being cut down in the first place.
And unfortunately, Systemic flaws like that essentially invite shocking criminal realities. In Brazil's Operation Greenwashing, investigators uncovered a massive fraud and land-grabbing scheme led by Ricardo Stopp Jr. Get this, red plus offset projects literally served as fronts to launder 38,000 truckloads of illegal timber taken right from indigenous lands. Meanwhile, major international brands were unknowingly purchasing these completely fraudulent credits, genuinely believing they were funding global sustainability.
Let's shift gears a bit. Chapter 4, the non-offsettable pollutants.
You see, focusing only on carbon creates this dangerous tunnel vision that completely ignores permanent, toxic harms to our environment. Take the global plastics crisis, for example. There are currently over 171 trillion pieces of plastic just sitting in the ocean. And as they sit there, sunlight ages them and they fragment into microplastics while releasing organic acids directly into the water. This physical degradation causes ocean pH to drop by up to 0.5 units. And here's the harsh reality. Absolutely no amount of terrestrial tree planting can physically reverse ocean acidification caused by synthetic polymers.
And then, of course, there are PFAS, commonly known as forever chemicals. These feature an incredibly strong carbon-fluorine bond that actively resists biological degradation. Because they persist for generations, their contamination creates a massive environmental liability, a literal permanent debt to the biosphere that falls completely outside of our current carbon-centric sustainability metrics. You simply cannot offset a forever chemical. This leads us right into Chapter 5, Corporate Pledges versus Reality. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between the lofty marketing rhetoric of major companies and their actual audited atmospheric impacts. I am just impartially walking through the data here. Amazon claims to have hit 100% renewable energy by 2023, yet their audited Scope 1 emissions are actually up 162%. Shell actively markets carbon-neutral gasoline while remaining one of the top global emitters. And Nestle pledges net zero by 2050, but they were among the companies that unknowingly purchased the illegal timber credits from that Brazilian scam we just discussed.
Let's analyze the Amazon paradox specifically because it's pretty wild. How on earth can a company hit its renewable energy goals early while its direct operational emissions simultaneously skyrocket by 162%? Well, the discrepancy relies on some very clever reporting loopholes. By focusing largely on its private label products, which make up a super tiny fraction of their overall sales, the company essentially gets to ignore the Scope 3 emissions for 99% of its total retail volume.
Finally, Chapter 6, the new regulatory frontier.
We're going to wrap up by looking at how governments, specifically the European Union, are finally stepping in to enforce scientific reality and close these exact loopholes. In 2024, the EU adopted the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition, or ECGT, directive. By September 2026, strict enforcement officially begins. And this is a game changer. It effectively bans generic environmental claims and completely ends the marketing of carbon-neutral products if that claim relies entirely on carbon offsetting.
To back this all up, the EU is introducing their carbon removals and carbon farming criteria to address the exact scientific flaws we've explored today. Step 1 demands permanence, meaning carbon must be demonstrably stored for at least 35 years. Step 2 requires additionality, meaning a project actually has to go beyond standard baseline practices. And Step 3 mandates biodiversity, ensuring these projects respect local ecosystems rather than just planting massive, fast-growing monocultures for a quick credit.
And honestly, this quote from the research sums it up perfectly. The era of voluntary, ambiguous climate pledges is being superseded by a regime of mandatory scientific substantiation. The gap between net zero rhetoric and zero-emission reality is rapidly closing, and the corporate market is finally going to have to adapt to the actual physics of our planet.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. When the phantom canopy fades, when the creative accounting and the offset illusions are finally stripped away by strict regulation, what is left but absolute emissions? Thank you so much for exploring this data with me today on InfoNow. Keep scrutinizing those corporate pledges and keep learning.